a cisternal puncture, like a lumbar puncture. You can do a cisternal puncture from here and access some CSF or cerebrospinal fluid. Then you have cisterna pontis or pontine cistern or pontine cistern. This encloses the vertebral and the basilar arteries. Encloses the vertebral and the basilar arteries. These are the blood vessels which take the blood from the outside of the neck or upper part of the trunk into the brain. Vertebral and the basilar arteries. Basal cistern present in the interpeduncular region. Therefore, it's called interpeduncular cistern. What does it enclose? It encloses circulus arteriosus or the circle of Willis. This is an important network of blood vessels which supply blood to all parts of the brain. Then you have the cistern of the lateral sulcus, which contains the middle cerebral artery, which is an important artery. Then you have cisterna ambiens, which is also called cistern of the great cerebral vein, which bears the vein of the same name, that is great cerebral vein. It's called cisterna ambiens. Cisterna chiasmatis, which lies below and in front of the optic chiasma. This is a crossing over of both the optic tracts. Okay, this is called the optic chiasma. Now, these cisterns actually form a cushion. All these cisterns form a cushion around the medulla and they protect the medulla. As we have already said, the function of these cisterns is to buffer important areas of the brain and protect them from extra pressure or extra shock. Okay, now there are arterial pulsations within the cisterns which force the CSF from inside onto the upper surface of the brain, upper or the outer surface of the brain. So these are all the cisterns or the dilatations present in the subarachnoid space. Let's now look at the communications between the subarachnoid space and the fourth ventricle. Now these openings are actually present on the roof of the fourth ventricle. There are three openings, which are one median foramen of Magendie and two lateral foraminae of Luschka. Cerebrospinal fluid comes from this fourth ventricle and then it communicates with the subarachnoid space. Okay, so there are three openings. The median one is called the foramen of Magendie. The lateral two are called the foraminae of Luschka. Let's now look at the prolongations of the spaces around the spaces of the arachnoid and the pia maters. The arachnoid space is prolonged around the neural lymphatics, especially of the first, second and the eighth cranial nerves. Okay, whereas the pile sheath extend even into the perivascular space, or they come along the blood vessels which actually pierce the brain substance. Okay, here the cerebrospinal fluid is in direct contact with the neurons themselves, the nerve cells themselves. Okay, what is important to remember here is that the arachnoid sheaths especially are specially demarcated or elongated around first, second and eighth cranial nerves. This picture shows you the lateral view of the ventricular system. Now this is one of the lateral ventricles. Okay, now this communicates through the interventricular foramen with the third ventricle. Okay, then the third ventricle communicates with the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, now if you notice, the shape of this lateral ventricle is sickle shaped. It is sickle shaped. Okay, so these are the four ventricles, two lateral ventricles which communicate through the interventricular foramen with the third ventricle. The fourth ventricle, the connection between third and fourth ventricles is called cerebral aqueduct. Fourth ventricle continues into the central canal of the spinal cord. Now we'll come to the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid, as the name suggests, is the fluid that circulates in the cranial cavity around the cerebrum or the main part of the brain, that is cerebro, and through the spinal canal. Okay, that is the spinal part of the cerebrospinal fluid. Now this fluid is actually produced within the substance of the brain. Okay, it's produced within the substance of the brain in the lining of the ventricles. Okay, that is where it is produced. It circulates all around the substance of the brain, through the spinal cord, and then it is absorbed. Okay, now this cerebrospinal fluid is actually a modified fluid tissue. It's modified fluid tissue, and it is present, or it is contained in the ventricular system in the subarachnoid space. Subarachnoid space is where you will find the flow of the CSF. Alright, it replaces lymph in CNS. That's something important that you must remember. There is no blood which is present inside the cerebrospinal fluid. It's only lymph. The RBCs are missing. Okay, so the presence of blood in the central nervous system or in the CSF is pathological. Okay, so it replaces lymph in the central nervous system. It performs all the functions of lymph: circulation, nutrition, protection, all these functions that lymph performs in the rest of the body. The CSF takes over in the central nervous system. The quantity of cerebrospinal fluid is maintained almost at a constant, which means that the rate of production and the rate of absorption is constant. Okay, the quantity is 150 ml at a time. Okay, rate of formation is about 200 ml per hour, or 500 ml is usually produced in a day. Okay, so that is the rate of formation of the cerebrospinal fluid. The normal pressure of the cerebrospinal fluid is measured not in millimeters of mercury, just like blood pressure, but it's measured as millimeters of water. So 60 to 100 millimeters of water is the normal pressure of the CSF or the cerebrospinal fluid. Let's now look at the formation of the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, the bulk of the cerebrospinal fluid is formed by the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricles. Now, these are blood vessels covered by the pia mater. Okay, the bulk is formed by the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricles. From each lateral ventricle, the cerebrospinal fluid travels through the interventricular foramen of Monro to the third ventricle. So, from both lateral ventricles through foramen of Monro, the CSF enters the third ventricle. From the third ventricle, it travels to the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct. Okay. Now, from the fourth ventricle, there are three openings or three apertures called median aperture of Magendie, two lateral apertures of Luschka. They are in the roof of the fourth ventricle. From the fourth ventricle, from the roof through the apertures, the CSF goes into the subarachnoid space. Now, from here through the medial foramen of Magendie, the fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid enters the central canal of the spinal cord and it bathes the spinal cord. From the lateral apertures of Luschka, the cerebrospinal fluid goes upwards, okay, and it bathes the outer surface of the brain. We'll later on look at a picture which will show you the same circulation. But this is the bulk of the formation of the cerebrospinal fluid. It is formed in the choroid plexus, especially of the lateral ventricles. To a smaller extent, the formation of CSF is in the third and fourth ventricles, choroid plexus. Now, this is the circulation from both lateral ventricles through interventricular foramen of Monro. It travels to third ventricle. From third ventricle to fourth ventricle is through cerebral aqueduct, and out of the ventricular system is in the roof of the fourth ventricle through the apertures, three apertures: the median aperture of Magendie, lateral two apertures of Luschka. Now let's come to the absorption of the cerebrospinal fluid. Most of the cerebrospinal fluid is absorbed through arachnoid villi and granulations and drain into the cerebral venous sinuses. Okay, from the arachnoid villi and granulations through the cerebral venous sinuses. Part of the CSF is drained into perineural lymphatics, especially around the first, second and eighth cranial nerves. Okay, Then you have veins related to spinal nerves which also drain part of the cerebrospinal fluid. That's the absorption of the cerebrospinal fluid. The production is in the lateral ventricles, choroid plexus, and the drainage is through arachnoid villi and the granulations. The functions of the CSF are, number one, they are protective in nature, especially because they act as shock absorbers for vital parts of the brain and also the blood vessel networks which pierce the brain. The patient is very, very irritable. Okay. Now, it is therapeutic. We have said that the CSF drainage can be of therapeutic value. If you take out a volume of the CSF, the headache and the raised intracranial tension features will come down. Okay, so that is the therapeutic value of the CSF drainage. Sometimes obstruction to outflow of the CSF can occur. As a result, the volume of the CSF keeps on increasing. This causes hydrocephalus in children. Now it's called hydrocephalus because the head swells up in size due to retention of the cerebrospinal fluid. Now in children, the suture lines or the line between the fusion of the two skull bones of any two skull bones is usually open. They are not fused like in the adult. Now this gives a lot of capacity for expansion. Okay, therefore hydrocephalus is usually seen only in children and not in adults. In adults, you will find a raised ICT sort of picture. Raised ICT or raised intracranial tension sort of picture. Okay, so these are all the clinical applications or the clinical importance of the cerebrospinal fluid. This picture shows you the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, now this is a lateral view of the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, now the cerebrospinal fluid is actually produced in the lateral ventricles, the left lateral ventricle and the right lateral ventricle. Inside they are lined by the choroid plexus. The site of production of the bulk of CSF is the choroid plexus of both the lateral ventricles. So it is produced here. From the lateral ventricles, it travels through the interventricular foramen of Monro into the third ventricle. Okay, from third ventricle, CSF enters fourth ventricle by cerebral aqueduct which connects the third and the fourth ventricles. Now from fourth ventricle, the CSF goes into the subarachnoid space by the median aperture of Magendie and two lateral apertures of Luschka in the roof of the fourth ventricle. Now through this median aperture, fluid enters the central canal of the spinal cord and also goes upwards and bathes the outside or convex surface of the brain. The cerebral surfaces of the brain are bathed by the CSF. Now after circulation here, the CSF is absorbed by the arachnoid villi and granulations. Okay, that's the absorption of the CSF. The CSF, as you can see here, bathes the inside and both the outside of the spinal cord. Okay, now the spinal cord ends here, as you can see, at the L2 vertebral level. Okay, so this is the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid.